I'm Walter Isaacson, and I'm with the Aspen Institute here, and it's our pleasure at the Institute to be the host and the facilitator of the Franklin Project. The project began when General Stan McChrystal was out talking about the importance of national service 2 or 3 years ago in Aspen, and everybody related to it. And one of the things we try to do here at the Institute is turn thought into action. So we said, well, if this is important, let's try to create a program around it. General McChrystal agreed to chair it. He also thought to himself, I'm never going to raise another idea in Aspen again. This is, you get enlisted, if not drafted, to do something. But I think he was able to convey to us that this works on so many levels. I mean, this is an important thing that every kid in America could have the rite of passage that previous generations had. Secondly, the notion that there's an expectation and an opportunity to be able to engage in national service. And I think both are equally important. Nowadays, there's just no expectation. You don't get out of your zip code, out of your comfort zone, and unless you really make the effort to, whereas in previous generations, it was just expected that you were going to serve somehow. But the other half of that equation is the opportunity. I think a lot of people coming out of college have been involved with Teach for America, and the biggest problem we have in Teach for America is 60,000 applicants for 4,000 jobs. There is a demand for people who want to spend a year or two in national service, but there isn't really the pipeline or the way to do it as easily. So I hope that through this project we can also say, we are going to find different opportunities. We're going to encourage organizations to create service slots, but maybe even create cores in which, whether it's the Baltimore core that's already been created, or through certain sectors, as we talk to the financial industry and others, cores that say we are going to have a service year project. One of the things that General McChrystal does in his Team of Teams book is talk about the need for coordination. I hope he'll explain that today a little bit, because just recently we've merged with a couple of other organizations and really creating the whole concept of a service year. Because in this world of nonprofits and NGOs, as Michèle knows so well, sometimes people keep replicating what other people are doing. And we have no, at the Aspen Institute, no goal or mission other than to make this work. So when we could find ways to say, why don't we join together and have other leaders of this project as well, that's good. I think it's important too to engage the Franklin Leadership Council, which is what's happening right now, engaging people on both sides of the aisle, both in the foreign policy and the defense community. I think history's really big moments have been when people have stepped up. You can reread The Greatest Generation, talking about a book I did with a friend many years ago called The Wise Men, which was stepping up at the beginning of the Cold War. But you can go all the way through to, the very beginnings when the First Continental Congress is meeting and people step up and pledge their lives, their liberties to a certain cause. That's been lacking today. I think that undergirds all of the civility and paralysis problems we feel in the public sector, is that people don't have the sense that they're in service for something larger than themselves. When I look at any of the great people I've written about, not just Ben Franklin, but even to Steve Jobs, at a certain point in life it kicks in that you're part of something larger than yourself. And I think that's what a service year can do as well. And so with that, I want to turn it over to Tara, who is at the Franklin Project, and will help introduce today's program. Thank you, Tara.
Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Tara Maller, the Associate Director for Strategic Communications at the Franklin Project. We'd like to welcome you to Beyond the Draft, Rethinking National Service, an event co-hosted by the Franklin Project with Defense One. And the genesis of this event today was our desire to talk about the intersection of national service with national security. Many of you have been invited here today because you hold jobs in government or previously held jobs in government in the defense community or have served in the military. We didn't anticipate this conversation would be taking place on the heels of a series of terrorist attacks and during heightened security warnings. But recent national security developments make today's conversation even more relevant. We did think about the timing of the event, and we thought that the presidential election is an opportunity to amplify national service in the national dialogue. Today, we want to explore with this panel how a significant expansion of national service here at home can help strengthen our country, impact perceptions of America overseas in terms of its soft power, and be an asset to our national defense in terms of building a talent pipeline, fostering bipartisanship, and strengthening our leadership. In thinking about the themes of today's discussion, I couldn't help but think about on the train back from New York over the weekend to DC, how many of our lives in this room, the trajectory of our personal and professional lives, were shaped by the events of September 2001 and 9/11. And I couldn't help but think about the calls to service and how many of us view service and think about service through that lens. And our experience with service has been shaped for many of us in this room through that experience. Even on our team, I served in the intelligence community. After those events, our director, Jay Mangone, served in the military, and other friends and colleagues have served in various capacities, including for other service-focused reasons, domestically in programs like Teach for America or City Year. And while we all might choose to serve for different reasons and different capacities, we here at the Franklin Project think that that service unites us through a common experience. And unfortunately, in the last 14 years, our commitment to service seems to have waned. There's not a sense of shared sacrifice after multiple years of war in Afghanistan and Iraq, and just under 1% of Americans serve in the military. So the Franklin Project believes the time is more ripe than ever for a transformative moment with regard to service. We see ourselves at a crossroads here, and we think that embracing national service here at home is more needed than ever before. So is there a way for us to ingrain national service in our national DNA beyond just moments of crisis? What are the benefits and challenges of doing so, and what would it look like? Can it strengthen our security? How can we rethink national service? So that's the focus of today's panel. We have a great panel here today. I'm so thrilled to have the three panelists and the moderator that we have here with us. If you could all come to the stage. We have Kevin Barron from Defense One will be moderating today's panel. Kevin has worked at Defense One as the executive editor, which is part of Atlantic Media. And I approached Kevin about partnering on this event because he's a military security analyst, both at Defense One covering the Pentagon, also now recently at MSNBC. So thanks for agreeing to do this with us. We also have the chair of the Franklin Project, General Stanley McChrystal. He's well known here at the Aspen Institute because his remarks at the Aspen Ideas Festival launched the project when talking about service. He's a retired four-star general, former commander of the U.S. and International Security Assistance Forces, Afghanistan, and a former commander of the premier military counterterrorism force, JSOC. He also is the co-founder of McChrystal Group and the best-selling author of My Share of the Task and Team of Teams. And he's been chairing the Franklin Project and in charge of our Leadership Council, of which Michèle Flournoy, we're honored to have her here today, an active member of the Leadership Council of the Franklin Project. She's the former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. She was the principal advisor to Secretary of Defense in the formulation of national security and defense policy, oversight of military plans and operations. And she's also the CEO of the Center of a New American Security, where she served as president until 2009. She also wrote a great piece for us on national service and national resilience, which I encourage you to check out. And lastly, we have Congressman Seth Moulton, serving from the 6th District of Massachusetts. Representative Moulton served 4 tours in Iraq as a Marine Corps infantry officer, including 2 tours as a platoon commander and 2 tours as a special assistant to General David Petraeus. He's been quite vocal on veterans issues, national security issues, and he's been a great champion of service, particularly for the younger generation of members on the Hill. So without any further ado, I turn it over to Kevin, and I look forward to hearing the discussion. Thank you.
Please, round of applause today. Thank you, Tara. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming out on the Monday after Thanksgiving, a rainy, cold Washington Monday. I'm sure you're all recovered from your tryptophan comas from Thanksgiving weekend, and I hope you all had a wonderful holiday weekend. And what a great way to start it off with a program about service. I think, when the holidays come, we hear about that in the news, and we see all these images of people volunteering and the president himself around the world, around the country for Thanksgiving. As Tara and Walter said, they approached me and Defense One, where I'm the executive editor, with this idea of putting together an event of some kind about national service. And I'll quickly say why it spoke to me right away, because we were speaking backstage about, this idea of national service comes up a lot. And in just the promotional tweets and Facebook shares we've been putting out in the last couple of weeks, I've gotten some pretty strong reactions of, man, I've been saying this all along, and what a great idea, which is a good thing to hear. And that's why we're here, is to, I think, help coordinate and congeal this idea into a real movement that becomes becomes the reality of the vision that the Aspen Institute has here. For me, before I was a journalist many moons ago, and then in like the 90s, I worked in think tanks around town as well, and as the NGO boom was really happening. And at the time, if you weren't going to join the military and you weren't going to go to the Peace Corps, there weren't a whole lot of organized options to get a young person out into the world, to see the world, to become a future global leader, or an American leader of some kind. And as eventually I became a Pentagon reporter, it became so clear how vast and vastly well-funded the military's recruiting organization is. And there's really nothing that even comes close, maybe in the entire, other than the NFL, I think, but when it comes to diplomacy or development or other ways of turning young Americans into global leaders, educated, skilled, impassioned, for some age of American leadership around the world that our political leaders keep telling us that we're in and that they want to get us into. So, with that, I was going to start with let's start with General McChrystal. Tell us a little bit about not just the origins of this idea of the Franklin Project, and we're here today to talk about national service in the realm of national security. But Tara had a good point of saying how everyone, if you're in the city and you're in this audience, you're already serving. You're already doing something that's beyond what the general public usually is involved with when it comes to serving, at least at the national government, whatever your issue is level. So I'm a journalist, member of Congress, military, civil, political appointee at the DOD. Why did you want to serve when you were young?
I'm going to do what panelists sometimes do. I'm going to cheat.
Go ahead.
Go off on a tangent while you forget the question.
It's okay. I have many follow-ups.
Walter often gives me credit for, resurfacing the idea. I mean, this idea has been out a long time. It's in history. What it has been it's allowed to get weakened over the last few decades. And so I just happened to come along at a time. And I will tell you something that it's been a real honor to be a small part of this. And my wife said something to me a few months ago. We were at an event like this and we talked. And afterwards she says, I think that if you all pull this off, this will be the best thing you were ever a part of in your life. And I think she's absolutely right. And so I'm going to sound a little passionate today, so I allowed you can discount some of that, but it's real. The second is the people on my left and right. The reason I'm honored to be up here is because they are friends, and they've been friends. Not only do we agree on this, but Michèle Flournoy, when she was the Undersecretary of Defense, was one of those people in the Pentagon that you wanted to meet with. And there's not that many people you want to meet with. And Michèle could tell you no, and she could tell you the hard truth in a way that, one, made you understand it, and two, made you want to work together. And that's pretty magic. And that's sort of at the basis of what leadership is about. And this is someone who could be off doing other things and making a whole bunch of money and raising her kids much easier, and yet she's dedicated herself. And then to my right, Seth Moulton. I met him at a dinner one night, and just an extraordinarily impressive Marine veteran. And when I meet a Marine, I automatically check my wallet and things like that. But we met, and here's a person who, again, has bona fides that I would kill to have on my resume, but yet he's chosen to serve. And he is the only politician I've ever actively supported. I actually went, remember we did the Peabody Elks Club campaign event when he was running for Congress. And that's hard work. I mean, for him, not for me. But it's because this is exactly the kind of person. And I didn't even ask him whether he was a Democrat or Republican when he first said he was going to run. I said, I'll support you, because it's the person and it's the idea of service that's so important. So now I'll circle around, Kevin, to the point. I think all of us are in agreement that there is something about service that is essential to citizenship, because citizenship is what defines a nation. The Lord Almighty didn't draw out nations and say, this is the United States of America, this is Mexico, and whatnot. Groups of people got together, and they made a compact or a covenant between each other and says, we will be a nation. And when they did that, they took on some responsibilities and they got some rights from that. They got to be defended. They got some other things that goes with being connected to other people, but you take on responsibilities, and you take on responsibilities for your fellow citizens. As Walter said, that last great line of the Declaration of Independence, we pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. And it says to each other. That's the point. It's not to some big idea, it's not to the flag, it's not to some, it's to each other, and that's really underpins it. So the question of citizenship and how you grow that is, I think, fundamental. If you go back to history in American society or any society where there was a need for mutual defense, you had to defend the outpost or raise barns or do things that absolutely had to happen. There was this need that you're going to do things because that's just the way of life. As we become more atomized and more anonymous in some areas, I think that's been weakened. And so what has happened is that with the exception of great big defining moments in the 20th century, like the Second World War, when 16 million Americans were in uniform and everybody was asked to do something, direct or indirect, you pull at people and you give them the experience, which is a positive experience, of serving. You know, we don't all volunteer to serve, and we all aren't happy about what we're given to do. But how many experiences we have in our life where afterward you go, well, you know, I probably wouldn't have done that by choice, but I'm glad I did. And to be honest, I think we have a generation before us now that we owe an opportunity, not to give them something they don't want to do, because actually demand shows that they do want to do it, but give them something that they can do that makes a difference, that is going to give them the experience for the rest of their lives. They feel invested in it. They feel, I'll steal this line from a panel I was on not long ago, they have an intimate relationship with their community and their nation. It's different from transactional. It's you're part of it. And so when I think about giving young people the opportunity, and over time I want it to be the implied responsibility to do a year of service, I think what we do is the greatest favor in the world, and we do the greatest favor because I think we then produce alumni. And it's not what they do during that year. That will be good work and it must be valuable. But really, the benefit of this is alumni. They are going to be, for the rest of their lives, different citizens. And they're going to interact differently, and they're going to have different relationships between each other. And if we don't do it now, I think that we will continue to suffer from all the things that Walter described. Sorry for preaching on like that, Ken.
No, when a four-star preaches, you let them preach, you know. That's I learned that long ago. All right, so forget the first question. As the journalist, my first question really is, what do you need to get this started? What's the first obstacle? Because this sounds like a great idea that's going to require either some huge government agency or some large outside of government body to coordinate, millions of American kids in a whole new, generational mindset. You remember Congress, you can create things like government agencies and fund them. What's the answer, either that you would like to happen or the more likely thing to happen to get all of this started and organized and funded?
So I think, first of all, thanks for hosting this great discussion. I think there are several things that can be done practically. The first is, as was already mentioned, the demand already exceeds the supply of these opportunities. We are turning away young people who want to serve already because the program pipelines are not big enough. So I think there's a first step of simply expanding the opportunities that exist, whether it's Teach for America or AmeriCorps or Peace Corps and so forth. But I also think we need to think beyond government and government funding. In my work with other nonprofits like the Mission Continues, I've found that in the private sector, there are many, many companies that would love to fund national service or public service opportunities. In the Mission Continues, they end up supporting service platoons in various urban centers across the United States. But you could imagine getting corporate funding, sponsoring national service in various communities around the country, as long as those were validated and certified as legitimate opportunities. So I do think there's a funding piece, but we shouldn't just think in terms of federal funding, although that is important. I think legislation to expand those opportunities is a start, but we also need to draw on other sources of funding across the country. Then you have to think about that expectation. How do you incentivize young people. All the polling of this next generation, and my own experience with my own teenagers, is that there is a desire to serve. People, they want to do something that is serving something higher than themselves. They want to connect with their communities. And so, is that not working? I'm sorry. Creating that expectation and some incentives. You know, I'm seeing high schools create an expectation that you will serve so many public service hours in order to graduate. You could imagine colleges viewing a year of service as a positive for admissions. You can imagine building on precedents like City Year, where people who do a year of service are given scholarships to use towards their college education. So we need to think about reinforcing that expectation with real concrete incentives for young people to go out and actually take advantage of these opportunities that we're able to expand. So there are a whole lot of concrete steps that need to be taken. I just want to add one more thought. I think this is a critical moment. I mean, General McChrystal's been out there beating this drum, Walter, everybody on this stage, and so many others. We are heading into a presidential transition and a renewal of Congress. This is a key moment to get this idea in the platforms of both parties, of all the candidates, no matter their political stripes, to say, this is a good idea for America. This is not a partisan idea. It's a smart idea. And to really move this, to try to tee it up as one of the main initiatives for a new administration, a new president, and a new Congress going forward.
Well, I want to talk more about that moment, but Congressman, so from your perspective, the answers to what comes next.
Well, I mean, I think this is tough, and I think that you know, the reality is in Congress today, there's an awful lot of things that don't get done because of the far right, and this is yet another issue that the far right is opposed to. So I think we've got to be honest about the politics, and I think as a community of people who are invested in national service and want to see it succeed, we've got to talk to the opposition. We've got to speak about national service in a language that the opponents understand and can relate to.
Well,
the economics.
People far right, they're not opposed to national service. They're opposed to how to do it.
Well, it depends on what your definition of national service is.
Right.
But I mean, look, expanding AmeriCorps, which for many people seems like a very obvious thing to do given the demand, is something that the far right calls paid volunteerism. Right? If you look at the ways that an expanded national service program would, I think, improve the quality of the military, not by making the military any bigger, but by largening the applicant pool of people who are interested in national service and might consider the military as an option. That's a great argument, and yet there are still a lot of people who are opposed to it. So I think it's important to speak about national service in broader terms than just the idea of service to the country, but also like let's look at the economics. Let's look at what a difference it can make in our communities. Let's look at what long-term investment, what the long-term returns on this investment are, and I think they're pretty impressive. You know, the best piece of legislation ever passed is the GI Bill. Right, just by looking at the cost-benefit analysis, you know, $1 invested for about $7 in return is the common figure thrown around. Well, if you expanded the GI Bill to have a civilian component, what would that look like? I don't know. When I got out of the Marines in 2008, I went to a conference on national service at Columbia, and it was my understanding, it was the only time in the 2008 campaign when Senator Obama and Senator McCain appeared on the same stage at the same time, talking about the same thing, but on the same side of the issue. And it was extraordinary for me as a young veteran who had just gotten out of, just come back from the surge in Iraq, to meet so many other national service veterans who hadn't had the same experience as I did and yet shared so much in common. The commonality that I had in my experience in Iraq with a Teach for America veteran from New Orleans, for example, was not something that I expected to see, and yet I saw that there at that moment. So there is the potential to really find political agreement on both sides of the aisle for an issue that does bring a lot of Americans together. But I think it's tough.
So talking about this moment then, you mentioned World War II. This is whatever you want to call it, that we're in the age of terrorism, the war on terrorism that's happening, the surge of ISIS, now events like Paris and terrorism coming closer to Western Europe, closer to the United States. That's the big worry. What are any of you hearing when it comes to the younger generation on their way up that wants to do something about it, that wants to get involved in a way that's that's different than perhaps just signing up for the military, or includes that, or any other way?
Yeah, I think one of the things that is a danger is that we look at something like ISIS as a fairly narrow terrorist threat, and therefore we want to do a fairly narrow counter-terrorist response to it, be a military and whatnot. And I think that that is failing to see a broader picture and the broader requirement. So ISIS is reflective of a collapsed region with all kinds of problems, and then ISIS itself is a multi-headed hydra that's not just a military problem. And so I think when we talk about having America prepared for this kind of threat, which I don't think ISIS is the last of this kind of threat, I think ISIS is just another in what's going to be a succession of these. What we really need to do is, in terms of national security, is have a sense that every American's a part of it. And I don't mean every American's carrying a gun, but every American's got a responsibility for the strength of our democracy, for the values that we represent, for all of the things that make us a more unified society, because really security begins with being a society that can get things done, both at the political level, but at the local level as well. And it's also things like educating our young people, preparing them to be part of the world. And then at the more, I guess, tactical end, we've got to be able to field diplomats and business people and NGO people who have the ability to operate in the world with a sense of confidence and certain skills, many of which come from this kind of experience. And one of the things that we found that was so challenging when we first got tested hard by Al-Qaeda in Iraq was that the different parts of the federal government, Department of State and the CIA and whatnot, were in these silos. And Defense Department, even the military, was in these separate silos internally. And when we tried to pull together a cohesive, multi-party response to it, we had terrific problems. We spoke different languages. We had completely different backgrounds. And they were all serving, theoretically, the same government for the same cause. But we didn't have those connections. And I think this kind of experience starts to build those, which I think are going to be really important.
If I could just add, I think the phrase that always comes to my mind is resilience. I mean, I think whether you're thinking about the long-term terrorism threat or other national security challenges that we're going to face, and frankly, economic challenges that we may face, national resilience, having the ability to bounce back, which we have done time and time again in our history. I mean, that is the history of the United States of America, is that we get knocked down and we stand back up, we reinvent ourselves, we find a way forward. And I think a national service program that, again, not necessarily mandatory, but with the expectation that this is something you do as an American citizen, as a sort of rite of passage to adulthood, that this would be something that would really invest in that fabric of resilience, first at the individual level by creating these young leaders and giving them that shared experience, but also at the community level, because they'd be working, to the extent they're working inside the United States, they would be working in some of the least resilient communities in the United States, trying to help turn them around and give them a sense of hope and potential for the future.
I'll just add that to really drill down on the threat of terrorism and where this could make a difference, I think we are not winning the fight against terrorism because we are not applying the full resources of the United States government. When we have a problem in Baghdad, we send in bombs and troops, and that's it. If you look at what happened when ISIS came in from Syria, they didn't just defeat the Iraqi army. The Iraqi army put its weapons down and went home because it lost faith in the Iraqi government. This is fundamentally a political problem in Iraq, and yet what's our government's response? We just send military trainers as if training the Iraqi army is going to fix Iraqi politics. ISIS, how many of you are on Twitter? So there are a good number of Twitter folks in the office, tweeters out there, right? I would venture to say there's probably no one here this morning who's as good at Twitter as ISIS. And we invented Twitter, not that long ago, right? So ISIS should not be beating us on Twitter. And yet they're killing us on Twitter. They're recruiting people right from here in America. over social media. So we need to, in order to really win this fight, we've got to apply a much broader range of U.S. resources. And you know what? You're going to find some people who may not want to join the Marines or may not be qualified to be an Army Ranger, but are really good at social media and could help in this fight. And you're going to find some people who are a lot older than myself or even anyone on this panel who are just really good at figuring out political problems in the Middle East. And we could apply them to that fight. When I was a platoon commander in the invasion, I had a platoon. It was in the first company of Marines into Baghdad. And 2 months later, I was asked to run a TV station. I was given a TV station, a radio station, and a newspaper south of Baghdad, because as we know, there was no real plan for after the invasion. So here was a second lieutenant, Marine Infantry Office, assigned to run the Iraqi media for South Central Iraq. I mean, Rupert Murdoch had nothing on Second Lieutenant Moulton in the middle of Iraq 2003. But I wasn't qualified to do that. I mean, I was coming back to, no one had ever trained me on basic media training, let alone how to run a TV station. That's a job that should have been done by someone else. And that's one of the opportunities, I think, with national service to really help our national security.
Can I jump on that? Because
Sure.
it's something that I think both Seth and Michèle led toward. Military service, we think right now, if you're in the service, if someone says my son or daughter's in the service, you immediately think uniformed service. If someone is a veteran, you think a veteran of military service. And I'm not sure that we haven't allowed that terminology to become too narrow. Because if we really think about it, just as Seth described and Michèle as well, what we really need is a much broader set of capabilities without everybody being in uniform, because one, you don't need them in uniform, and that's not where their talent's best focused. But yet their service should be like two sides of the same coin. Military service and other service ought to be equally respected, it ought to be equally rewarded, and it ought to be equally encouraged. And so when we think about it, when a person comes of age, the discussion around the dinner table should be, so where are you planning to serve? And any of these spectrum things would be fine. And they bring where they are best and whatnot. But we have to step away from the idea that only military service is asked to board the airline first. Why couldn't JetBlue Airlines, I'm on the board, say, all people currently doing your year of national service, board first? I mean, little things that would respect and reflect people. Why couldn't we have a GI Bill for everybody who serves and just make it a service bill after you've served? I love President Obama's idea of community college free. As my wife said, just put a comma at the end that says, right after you finish your service, your year of service. But then, because then they've invested. They get something, but they paid for it indirectly. You know what I mean? But the country gets a win both ways. We get people with better values who serve, and we get people who take part in education.
How about student loan forgiveness for those?
I think all of those kinds of things should be tied to this because, again, they're investments in the nation's future, I believe.
Well, Congressman, you mentioned this is a U.S. government problem, and keeping with terrorism and what we need. On the campaign trail, when ISIS hits and when Paris hits, I feel we still don't hear many more solutions offered other than we need 10,000 troops, we need 20,000, we need more of whatever's been doing, more of the targeted bombing campaign, the more military. I don't hear, correct me if I'm wrong, any type of talk coming from either candidates, Republican or Democrat, or even the White House or the administration saying, what we really need is what you're saying, a whole of government, whole of country, whole of nation approach to how are we all going to dig in and we all need to come together to fight ISIS. I didn't hear that in the president's message. It's still so targeted on the military campaign that has to happen first. The region has to pacify itself. The grand foreign policy and politics that we are used to hearing about, not any kind of call to action for the country.
Yeah, I actually think that there was a missed opportunity in that regard right after 9/11 in terms of calling on Americans to everyone find a way to do something to help our national resilience, to find some way to serve in this time. I actually think, unfortunately, the sort of emergence of the ISIS threat, and particularly what's happened in Paris, I think this is another moment where that call could and should be made. I was interested to read that, in France they're having a similar response of overwhelming response from young people to try to join wherever they can join, which military, police, intelligence services, whatever. How can I do my part in the wake of this? And again, this is the time to open up the aperture. So military service or service in the intelligence community, although laudable and wonderful and right for some people, it's not going to be right for everybody. So let's open up the aperture to take advantage of that desire and create other opportunities. Just on this, there are obviously wonderful opportunities to serve at home. But on serving abroad, I mean, I just want to underscore the point that Congressman Moulton made. When we put together the Afghan strategy, there was clearly a military campaign that was going to create stability, but that was going to create space for other things to happen. And those other things had to be in the political and economic and other domains. And yet it was so hard to create a civilian search, to find those people who could go abroad and run the media, help create the new Afghan free media, or help take a newly stabilized area and make sure we got the economic development piece right, or help ensure that political reform was proceeding apace in Kabul. It was so hard to get that talent and then to sustain it over the course of the campaign. And I think a national service program could be a way that not only drew in young people, but perhaps people with more experience and expertise. It would be another way to help meet those requirements when they do occur abroad.
You think that could have created a pool from which to take from? I remember
Absolutely.
Secretary Gates was considering mobilizing reservists to do these civilian jobs.
Yeah,
he said, just send them in plain clothes out of their uniform.
We were combing the
surprised that wasn't
reserves,
happening.
the military reserves for the civilian skills. Where are the agricultural experts? Where are the city planners? Where are the folks who've built media? And it was very challenging because the system wasn't really built for that.
And I think that's the point, is the system's just not built. The painful piece of this is that there are a lot of Americans out there who want to contribute these talents.
Well, I'll let the audience know we'll get to a good section for questions near the end, so have them ready. And same thing for those of us watching online. This was an invite-only event, so you guys are the fancy lucky people who got to be here. But there should be hopefully a good number of folks online who could maybe through Twitter somehow get us some questions to us as well. But so again, you said there's not a system for it, and there's a lot of need, there's a lot of desire. How do you create the system? What is step one? I mean, where is it? Are we going to have the same problems of organizations creating their own things and duplicating themselves, and this giant mesh of opportunities that every individual college counselor is going to have to sift through, versus having one, or some sort of centralized organization that we're going to be the clearinghouse, we're the funneling organization to, connect the skills to the needs, to be the recruiting office, be the PR public face. I mean, you're talking about an enormous undertaking.
Can I take the first part of that? Because
Take it on.
The Alliance, now the Service Year Alliance, which Franklin is a part of, has taken a great step forward in this. There's much more to do, though. And the first thing, there's some practical things that have to be done. A digital platform has been created that's going to create a marketplace. And at the end of this year, it'll be open for business. And young people and their parents will be able to go online and look at the various opportunities. Organizations like NGOs or others that have opportunities will be able to put those in line. Donors or other people who want to support can go online and they can provide funding. Also, you'll be able to see what the requirements are for a certain position. You'll be able to connect with people who have done it or are doing it. So parents and young people will be able to look and say, is that right for me? Is it safe for my son or daughter? And that sort of thing. So that's going to create a much more efficient tool to allow us to make this work. But there are a number of other things we've got to do as well. One is we've got to create incentives. And one of the greatest incentives, of course, is expectation. If your parents, brothers, sisters, uncles, aunts have done service, that creates a family expectation. But also you want to get around the lunch table at school. You've got to get where enough people have done it so you're not the albino unicorn. who's doing it that no one else has ever thought of. And so you got to have that opportunity. Then you've got to get different elements to support this. And we've done a lot of work with universities. Mackenzie Moritz in the back and has been working. And so we're trying to get universities to do several things. One, we're trying to get them to give preferential admission if you've served. We're trying to get it on the common application, just a box. Did you serve? Because, nobody wants to get in a good school wants to put no. And then there are other schools, like started first by Tufts, put in programs like the 1+4. So you apply, and if accepted for a 4-year program, you add a year at the beginning and you do national service for the year, and you belong to Tufts for the whole 5 years. And one of the things that does is it takes the angst away from parents. Your young daughter or son applies to a school, and then they say, well, I really want to go off and do city year for a year. I want to do the Peace Corps. And you go, you barely eked into that school. We don't want to chance this one.
Have you met my parents?
And then you go, well, no, he's guaranteed, because under this, a year from now, they get in, or maybe it's 2+1 or 2-1-2, or some combination thereof. And then we want to get businesses, and there's a set of businesses, of which my own is one, that gives up front says, we are employers of national service. We value national service. And what we want to do is get that with a lot more teeth, so that big name companies, and let's just pick Goldman Sachs, and I've been talking to them, we'd like Goldman Sachs to say, okay, we interview bright young person coming out of Yale. We want to hire you, and we want you to go do a year of national service, and your job is waiting for you as soon as you finish national service, guaranteed. If you don't finish national service, apply elsewhere. But if we could create that kind of expectation where all businesses were doing that, then at high end, of course, only a small group of people can apply to a Goldman Sachs, but bigger companies could do the same thing. They could give guaranteed jobs, they could give preferential hiring, they could do all kinds of things that make it easier to incentivize. And then at the back end, we talked about those things like a GI Bill or other things that make it easier. Right now, for a young person to do national service, it's a little scary because you're going to fall behind your peers. Your parents worry that you're not going to get on with whatever you're going to do next. We've got to take those away. We've got to make this not something you've got to jump over. We've got to make a bridge across this so it is the easiest way to go. And if it's the easiest way to go, those who have doubts, I think, will be more likely to do it.
Well, so what are the differences between private sector, public, university of either need or desire or ideas to make this happen?
Everybody I talk to is for it. One of the problems with this issue is, with the exception of people who worried about the funding of it, our opposition is inertia. Do nothing. And so we kind of say, well, that's a nice, and when I talk to a lot of groups, they go, Stan, that's a nice idea. And you can see in their mind, they're going, yeah, but it's too high, too dark, too wide, too whatever, we just can't do stuff like that in America anymore. And that's, if you stop and think about that, that's really scary. If that's what we're saying. I tell people, I read a book a couple of years ago about the building of the Boulder Dam. And at the end of it, the author says this was an amazing thing. We couldn't do it now. We could never get the different states to agree on the water rights and all the things. We just couldn't do that level of a thing because it takes too much coordination and agreement. And this is that kind of thing. And so what I would say is what we've got to do is convince people the value is so great and the need is so compelling that we step back from our fears and we do it. And I do think all the players are ready. They just want to see everybody else do it first.
The irony with that statement in some ways is that there are a lot of thinkers out there much smarter than I who would say that the reason we can't do big things like that is because we don't have national service, because we don't have a common experience. We've never had fewer veterans in Congress in our nation's history than we do today, and a lot of the older guys talk about how it was different when you knew that you may have political differences, but you could focus on what was best for America when you came to Congress because you had that common experience of fighting together in the war.
That's right.
But is some of that a product of necessity versus opportunity? Meaning, there's a lot of romanticism about the WPA and CCC days, but there was also massive unemployment and people needed these jobs, and it was a purposeful top-down government way to get everyone organized, which ended up with these gigantic public works projects. Thinking of it in that kind of light, is there really a need for American kids to say, I'm going to take a year off and go help the world when they can just enter the workforce and a lot of them make some good bill and just get going? Or not feel the connection, like you said, with the military. You're not part of the 1%. Not feel the connection to the war on terror. Not feel the connection to, anything to do with global security, which is, in this room, we're in the Aspen Institute in Washington and DuPont Circle. They get it.
Look, if we as a nation were knocking it out of the park right now, they might say, hey, we don't need to change anything. But I don't think that's the general assessment of how things are going. Right? So I think that there is a need for this because it will make us a stronger nation.
But do you think that people believe it enough to do it, or is it going to require on their own, or will it also require a very coordinated top-down somebody, maybe like a 4-star general, to organize and force this on Americans to say this has to happen, and America at writ large need to get going with this?
I think it's both. I think you need senior leaders using their bully pulpits to create a top-down call for this, and do it across sections of government, parties, civil, military, and so forth. But I also think it's going to resonate because I think Americans, we may not have the economic crisis we faced at the time that you mentioned, but I think there's a crisis of public confidence in our government and our ability to come together as a society and to work across the aisle and to make decisions and compromises and move things forward. And I think you see both anger but also potential for apathy. And I think a lot of young people are looking for something positive to contribute to moving things forward. Government's been decried as, not the way to go. The partisanship is very polarizing. But I do think there's a window that people feel that we are not our best selves. We are not showing our best selves. And I want to be part of doing something that does show America's best, contribute to American resilience and our, appealing to our higher angels or whatever the right phrase is, but living our values more fully. And I do think that, again, we're just talking among my kids and their friends and other young people I meet, there is a certain hunger to do something differently than what is being offered to them right now. And I do think, so if you had the call from the bully pulpit, you had some investment, both public sector and private sector, and you created some opportunity, I really do think you'd have a lot of people taking up the incentives.
So it could be the other way, go the other direction, crowdsource stuff. I'm glad you mentioned, the lack of trust in institutions, and I'll plug our sister National Journal, and Ron Brownstein has done some excellent work on just that, the real decline in trust of any large institutions, not just governments.
The most frequent question I received on the campaign trail last year was not how to improve Obamacare or what to do about ISIS. It was, why are you doing this? You have so many opportunities. Why do you want to run for Congress? And that's not a good thing. That's sad, right? If they're saying you're actually kind of talented, Seth, don't go to Congress, right? No, that's a real problem for us as a country and for a government. And by the way, there are 5 or so AmeriCorps applicants for every 1 AmeriCorps slot today, if that number's correct. If you expanded opportunities, you would see that number go up. You would see demand rise. When I decided I graduated in June of 2001 from college. So when I decided to join the military, it was before September 11th. And I have one of my best friends from college. He and I used to meet for breakfast all the time and have different debates about anything. The only time he ever got just seriously angry at me was the day I told him I was joining the Marines. And he slammed his tray down. I remember exactly where we were sitting, and said, "That's stupid," in slightly more colorful terms. And he walked out. And he felt that way because he cared deeply about me, and almost like a parent didn't want me to do something that would be a waste of my time. And a year later, he joined the Army. And he didn't join the Army because I was some leader that he wanted to follow or anything like that. We were just good friends, but we shared the same values. And because I had gone into the Marines, it made this a more accessible opportunity. It made it seem like something that wasn't so strange or weird to do as a Harvard graduate when you went out into the world. And that's the hump that we've got to get over, to just make this an expectation in society. I don't think it's actually that hard.
So before we go to the audience then, I want to have all of you get specific. You ran a war, you helped design a war, you executed a war, and to put it bluntly, as journalists do. What skills are needed? I mean, what are the skills for national security? I mean, whether it's rifleman or diplomat or city planner, agriculture engineer, expand on that idea of, if you could go out right now and tell universities, tell Goldman Sachs, tell, any institutions, whatever they are, this is what we need American kids to start doing so that the U.S. is better prepared in the next 5, 10, 30, for the 30-year war against global terror, the 100-year war, whatever it is. Specific to national security, what do we need right now?
Well, I'll start. It's problem solving, because you don't know what problem you're going to be given. I don't care if you're in the Department of State or CIA or military, you're going to run media, you're going to do something. We can't predict the next war. And to be honest, the shooting part of it is the easy part. That's commoditized. It's the problem solving that's the hard part. So that would be one. The second would be cultural acuity. And it's the ability to work outside of your own culture, sometimes just across the United States in different zip codes, but also in foreign countries. And so the kinds of experiences I'd want young people to have is go somewhere, be part of a team, solve problems in a culture that you didn't grow up in. And some of that should be overseas, so you know how to maneuver with confidence in different cultures, and you develop enough empathy so you realize that other people's perspectives are not automatically wrong. And we suffer from that. And if you did those two things, all of the other technical skills, you could teach people along the way. They don't bother me at all. It's those two basic, experientially based things I think are key.
What do you think, Flournoy? Would you want to send your kids? I mean, your kids are older. One of them doesn't have a choice anymore, probably. But would you want to send your kids to the Middle East to learn cultural skills at a time like this?
It would depend on the situation,
Yeah.
but potentially. No, I would just add two or three more to Stan's starting list. One is the experience of doing something really hard and not giving up, and working through the obstacles and the adversity to get to some level of success, and that experience of persistence and kind of fighting through a problem to get to the other side, I think is really, really important. I also think that some experience of just leadership, having an opportunity to not only be part of a team, but in a certain task area or for a certain period of time, be the leader, be someone who's in charge of inspiring and directing and guiding other people in your peer group. And then the last thing is the sort of planning and execution piece. So many people, certainly in the policy community, believe that you're done when you get the president to make the speech and the policy is stated. It's wrong. That's maybe the beginning of the process. But having people who actually know how to take an idea and do the planning and the assessment and the work to actually figure out how to implement. And again, surmount obstacles, deal with all the uncertainties that will pop up and ruin your initial plan, and then now you have to adapt and adjust. I think that kind of adaptive planning, implementation kind of experience also could be extremely valuable for developing these young people as future leaders.
I'll just add one more characteristic, which is the opportunity to have tremendous responsibility, but also potentially fail.
Such as?
Because I think one of the things the military does well is it pushes you very far, gives you tremendous responsibility at a young age, but understands that some people are going to fail, and the institution and the project will survive in spite of that. And I can't tell you how much I learned as a young person from some of the failures I had in the military, not just the successes.
Well, I'll add an observation instead of an advocacy point, since I'm a journalist, that I think too often the skill to navigate Washington is greatly underestimated as a need for any organization. And if global leadership is the goal, or a greater cadre of people to do it, being whether you're a rifleman or an agricultural or a digger or whatever it is, that's the skill for the time for now. But if you can't come back to Washington, or there are people in Washington who can advocate and be the champion for that issue, well, we know what happens in Washington. So to our audience, let's have some good questions for this wonderful panel. We have a nice mix of them, and I've got this gentleman with this quick hand right in the front. Please tell us your name,
Thanks, Mike.
where you're from, who you are, keep it short, and ask a question, or I'm going to cut you off.
My name is Dr. Chris Howard. I'm the president of Hampton-Sydney College.
Welcome.
Soon to be the president of Robert Morris University. And I'm also on the Senior Leadership Council with that fine journal that I worked for when I was in the Air Force. Stan, I mentioned this before. I'll say it one more time. I love the idea of two sides of the same coin. I think that we should have literally a coin that has two sides, national service and military service. And I think a lot of people would print that for free. I wrote an op-ed about it in the Huffington Post, but I wanted to advocate for that again because young people like shiny things. And so let's give them a shiny thing to put in their pocket to let them know that they're connected.
An actual coin.
An actual
like
coin.
A challenge coin.
Like a challenge coin, but with national service. Yeah, you can, even as a journalist, you got that, right? We're track, and don't cut me off. Now, last two things very quickly. So teaching at University of Oklahoma, teaching at Hampton-Sydney, teaching at Robert Morris in the future. In the past, I had two young people I remember vividly, one Native American kid, one African American kid, both got into Teach for America, and I remember talking to them going, they're not coming from, not because they're Native American, African American, they didn't have much money, they didn't have much resources. And so as I was advising them, they finally, I said, I know you want to do this, and I'm encouraging you to, but I know you need some resources. Both of them ended up, one went to a private school to teach, one went to Morgan Stanley. We lost two great young people, but did we lose them? So how do we deal with that chasm of wealth, especially what you're saying in terms of, do we need government support to give them the resources? Because some people don't have the luxury or feel like they don't have the luxury to serve because they need to, handle the bills. Thanks.
This is a good point. So the path to the military for many, especially for either economically disadvantaged or minority races, was financial. It was a quick way to a paycheck and a quick way to the GI Bill to get that skill. Yeah. But does it then transfer? If you're going to go do national service, not just join the military right away, is that a path? How do you keep them from going on a path that leads them away from national security?
Take that. Well, I would say I think it's a little bit of a mistake to say that everybody who ends up in the military, or even a large percentage, did it for financial reasons. I mean, I certainly knew that in my platoon of Marine infantrymen, if you ended up in the Marines and in the infantry in that place, you really wanted to be there.
Sure. No, it was one of for some categories of recruits.
So I think you got to be a little bit careful. But I think the point is that you can't feel a consequence, a real negative consequence to doing national service. And I know, Stan, you've thought about this a lot.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And Chris's point is good. And it gets to the point I was trying to say about the bridge. It's got to be considered a good thing, not a bad thing. So if the person decides to do Teach for America instead of Morgan Stanley, they shouldn't feel like this was either or. They ought to feel like it's this and that. And so places like big businesses of all kinds ought to be just anxious to grab people as they come out of service. And it ought to be well known to everybody serving that this is a very advantageous step. And the reason on the service year, one of the reasons we push it must be, in my view, a year, because you want to be completely immersed in it, but it must be paid, because you don't want it limited to people who have outside money from family or something like that. It's got to be everybody. And for people who don't have resources, it's got to, again, be, when I come out, I am more advantaged than I was going in. So it's not like I gave up a year or two and I'm behind my peers. It means I'm actually going to be a step ahead of them. And this gets into the incentives that we talked about.
And just real quickly on that, I remember when I applied to different companies after school, because I like most college graduates, couldn't decide what I wanted to do, and national service was not one option. But I applied to several companies, and there was one company out there that said to me, we would rather have you go serve in the military for a few years and then come and work for us in the future because we think you'll be a better leader. Every other company just said, come right now. If we could instill that, it was Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railway. And you know what? The first company that I called when I got out of the military was BNSF, because I valued that they valued my experience.
But you didn't become a railway man. You're not a conductor. One day,
I spent a year working on a high-speed rail project in Texas before I ran for Congress. Believe it or not. So
there you go.
There's a connection, I guess.
We'll go ahead. This young woman in the front.
Hi, Anastasia Delaccio with Sister Cities International. I'm also a young leader with Franklin Project. I think that I've been hearing a lot about part of the barrier is actually parents. And so I'm wondering if there's some sort of strategy as well to engage them. I'm thinking about mom bloggers. I know government with Study Abroad has really done a lot of engagement from them, and it's worked. I know the UN Foundation, I helped to engage mom bloggers a lot with the Shot at Life campaign in order to educate people around vaccines. And I think part of the barrier is that parents are scared, both for one, financial reasons, and two, they don't want their children to go out and be potentially at harm. But if they're educated more, then they're more likely to push their kids to go serve. So.
Yeah, no, I do think there's a huge public education component to this, and parents, engaging parents to reassure them that not only is, first of all, it's safe, but also that it's advantageous. And I think, you know, I love the idea of having just gone through the Common Application, putting the box on the college application form that says, did you serve, and having that be a plus. That's one of the most powerful things you could do for any parent who's trying to help their child's advancement, is they see anything that's a plus is going to get their attention. And then you couple that with this digital marketplace where they can actually go and look at real opportunities, you know, what might work for their children, hear from real people who've already done that, had that experience, get that reassurance and so forth. I think there's potential there, but you are right. The word has to be gotten out. It is not out now, and it is a sort of unknown and therefore slightly scary to most parents right now.
We have this one in the front. I had a hand up for a while. Front row. We'll work our way around.
Hi, Kathy Roth-Duquet with Blue Star Families. I had the opportunity, I wrote a couple books in 2006, 2008 that thought a lot about national service, and so I got to research that topic. Everyone wants national service. When you do public opinion polls, the majority of people are interested in an optional national service, and the majority of young people are interested in it too. Most political figures see the benefit of it if there's not a price tag associated with it. So I don't think you need to spend time convincing people that national service of some kind, a voluntary one, is a good idea. Every system is perfectly designed to get the outcome it gets. We don't have national service right now because our system is designed for us to not have it. So I think you're exactly right, that lowering the transaction costs and increasing the incentives will get something that we already have a large recognition that we need to do. There are two opportunities that spring to mind to me in addition to the, I think, excellent ones that you all have suggested. One is that ROTC developed as a concept in America because the major universities demanded it. They said that to have as America was becoming a great power, we needed an officer corps that was trained in the civilian values. I think if you could mobilize the Franklin Project, could mobilize many of the major college presidents to call for this and to include it on the Common App, but also to make it a positive thing, that's an opportunity. I also wonder if the selective service moment isn't an opportunity to ask people to consider this and perhaps build in something more structure. It's something that's already exists in law.
Yeah, can I take that? Because Kathy and I are old friends, but I completely agree with everything that you said. We've been working with the college presidents and whatnot, and a lot of them, and you get support, but colleges are, and this not to be negative, are essentially conservative institutions, and to get a significant change in how they do business, it takes some pressure. Some of the things I'd like to see is lowering transaction costs. We have military recruiting stations. And right now, in some places, you have separate Marine Corps, Navy, Air Force, what if you had a recruiting station that is a service recruiting station, and you go in there, and on one end of the spectrum, you've got the Marine Corps, on one end of the spectrum, or one place you've got the Peace Corps, another place you've got all of these different opportunities. So if you walk in and you're not suitable for one, you can go to the other. And then just the economies of things like getting your data. There are certain things, biometrics, that they have to get, all these kinds of things. And a parent could go into this place, and they could be physical places, and they could be virtual. And so as a consequence, as you're doing this, the opportunity to see, I'm here to serve, wow, there's this whole spectrum, and where do I fit? And I just think it's a compelling idea, but it gets a lot of different entities that have not traditionally worked together to hold their breath and hold their nose and get in the same place and do it. And I think it just would be really powerful we can move forward.
You think Human Resource Command is going to let the Peace Corps set up a desk inside the Army recruiting station?
I think that if the military doesn't have a good enough product to save it, to compel itself, that would make it better. If you think about it, it would always make everyone would have to keep tuning their product.
If you expand opportunities for national service, as I described earlier, more people will be interested. There will be a lot of 18-year-old kids who said, I wasn't going to do anything. But if I have an expectation to do something, heck, I'm not going to do the Peace Corps, I'm going to be an Army Ranger, or I'm going to join the Marines. So the number of applicants for the military goes up, the talent pool improves, and it's going to benefit the military a lot to do this.
I had back there in the glasses.
So Scott Beal, the CEO.
Wait for the microphone, please.
Good morning. Thank you for this great conversation. My name is Scott Beal. I'm the CEO of Atlas Corps. We bring leaders from around the world to volunteer in the United States and Americans to serve overseas. Congressman, I'm particularly interested in your comments about how ISIS is out social media, the U.S. government and U.S. society in general. And I really do think that as part of this conversation, it needs to talk about how more Americans need to serve overseas through Peace Corps and other programs, particularly in Muslim-majority countries. And frankly, leaders from around the world, including leaders from Muslim-majority countries, need to come and serve in the United States. So we can find ways to work together and to not just counter violent extremism in social media, but counter violent extremism working side by side. So to the extent that this, which I'm a big proponent of national service, but can be a larger conversation about service in general, I think helps solve both problems at home and around the world, which, as we see in Paris and around the world, really, we need new answers for. We need new solutions for.
So a plug for exchanges as a national service option.
I've been out there the past couple of weeks about the importance of keeping the open door for Syrian refugees who are coming here. The very targets of ISIS, I think we're actually harming our national security to shut off that flow of refugees because it's something that ISIS can use against us. And I'll tell you, I have gotten more emails from fellow military veterans who have talked about how they're worried about their Afghanistan or Iraq translators or how much they learned from bringing those allies here to the United States in support of my position. And I think it speaks to exactly what you're saying. It's, these military veterans, look, they're disproportionately Republicans, conservatives by some measures, and yet they had that cultural experience overseas, and so they get this issue, I think, much better than a lot of Americans.
That's good. We'll go back this way, the gentleman with the beard in the middle there. Let's see.
Thanks. My name is Dave Salamine. I own a company that helps candidates talk about national security and foreign policy issues. And I think all of the routes you've discussed today have been college-bound routes. I've heard Harvard and Yale talked about from the stage. Probably 99% of the folks in this room have a college degree. 70% of Americans don't go to college. And within 30% that do, there are huge economic and racial disparities. So our goal is uniting people around a shared experience. I worry that if we're only thinking about college-bound routes, what we're actually doing is taking an even narrower segment of that 30% and making it an elite experience, not a shared experience. So then we can talk a little bit about that.
Let me take this. Yeah, let me take this one because I think you probably haven't been listening to everything we said. Because we talked about the requirement that it be a paid experience so that every part of our social strata, economic strata can do that. We talked about employers, not just the high-end employers, but we talked about wider Walmart and others. So you're exactly right. It's got to be for all young Americans because one of the things we're looking for is things that connect all young Americans first to each other. I think the international part's very, very important and the cultural part. But the reality is what we have been pushing for here, it has a greater participation now at the high end because people can afford to do it. And there tends to be a background. We're trying to knock that down, and that's why you need the incentives. As we talk about the bridge, if someone's in a tough neighborhood now and the opportunity is go do a year of service or get a job when it's available right now, and they have to support somebody, then they got to grab the nearest thing. It's just the obvious thing to do, so they grab that. And so I think you're exactly right. We've got to make it a cross-leveling experience so that we don't have unique zip code experience or educational level experience or religious or anything else, because as Charles Murray captured so well in Coming Apart, we are fragmenting in so many ways we don't even recognize. And this could be that unifying thing. I tell people sometimes my first platoon in the Army, I was a paratrooper platoon leader in the 1970s, and the Army was not at its best in the 1970s. And my platoon, when they ran out of beer money at the end of the month, they had an electric cord, and they would plug it into a wall, and they separated the two leads to it, and they frayed it, and they would stand in a circle, and they would basically recharge themselves. We laugh at that, and we go, what a bunch of knuckleheads. But they were great young paratroopers. Most had not, well, I don't think any had gone to college. Many had had some pretty tough upbringings, but they were great young Americans, fearless young paratroopers, and they were the kind of people that when I spent time with them, I came away better. They took the young West Point graduate who'd grown up kind of in suburbia, and they made me a better person. And I think that happens to all of us both ways.
I rely on those guys today. I mean, I have a Facebook group with one of my platoons. We talk almost every day, and I have told them, just in my new job as a congressman, if you ever see me losing touch, becoming one of them in Washington, I want you to call me out on it. And I look to my fellow Marines more than any other group of friends to do that.
Okay. Let's go back to the front row here. We had an early question waiting patiently.
Thank you all very much. My name is Lorelei Kelly. I'm working with the new Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the Senate. It's up in Boston, sort of like a presidential library, but for Congress. I'm setting up a program called Resilient Democracy, and we're looking at how to bring Congress into the 21st century, essentially. I know the bad news about Congress, as you pointed out, Congressman Moulton, is people watch House of Cards. The good news is that Congress is not organized enough to be that awful.
It's true. It's an astute observation.
I worked on the Hill for many years as a civil military person, helping both Democrats and Republicans. And it was my impression that the military had sort of decision support systems for information supply and decision making that we could bring in for civilian decision support. Today, the possibilities for legislatures are immense. Like Michèle, I've known forever for all her work on how would you look at a unified security budget? How would you look at a system that could compare across civilian and military so we can prioritize? I think that Mr. Ryan would be really interested in this, and these tools are available now. Data feeds in committee hearings. There's all these young people with tremendous technical skills in every district in this country, and I'm wondering, are you working with technologists and civic technologists in your district? Do you see that as one way to realign the interests of young people with governing? And I'd love to know too, Michèle, where you're seeing this, because I feel like that is the sweet spot for service and renewal and the modern era.
Well, let me let Michèle answer this from a policy perspective, but I'll just say we have a computer programmer on staff, and I don't know if there's any other House office or Senate office on Capitol Hill that actually has a programmer as our software engineer as a member of the team. So I think this is absolutely essential. And if you just walk into my congressional office, you'll be greeted with a big vertical TV screen that we call the dashboard, that we're trying to use to talk not just about the work that we're doing, but about how people in our district are doing and how they interact with us in the congressional office. So this is something I believe in. It sounds like a planted question, but I know it's not. This is something I think we have a huge opportunity.
I think it's a great idea of figuring out how do you leverage people who are interested in things like big data analytics to support and help target where we focus our opportunities for national service. Because even if we were wildly successful in what we've all been talking about here this morning, the actual need, the communities that could use that kind of attention and support, the need is so overwhelming to even what we could imagine being able to provide in terms of a supply. You're going to need people to help figure out where is the highest, best application of these resources. And I think getting the young people who are very technology literate and very interested in that kind of analysis to be part of a national service structure would be, I haven't heard that idea before, but it's a really good one.
This side over in the back with the, yeah, waving your hand. I saw you earlier.
Hey, my name's John. Thanks for the talk. Former military officer. Just finished my PhD in War Studies, King's College London, and member of the Truman National Security Project. So my question is really about kind of principles. We started by talking with General McChrystal about the founding documents of the country, and I noticed this interrelationship between national security as a concept and national service as a concept. It seems like one of the problems is if we need a lot of public sector funding, getting people to agree not just what the nature of national service is, but what the nature of national security is. And a lot of people, at least in this town, part of the narrative, they want to be very restrictive about what that means. And so often it's limited to military and kinetic aspects of military stuff, whereas we're talking about education, building communities, public diplomacy. I guess the question is, how do we think, if we want to do national service and promote that, how do we think we need to shape the narrative on what it means for, in the 21st century, to promote our national security?
Yeah, I would start. I think that's a great question. When we try to articulate, and I think I do a poor job, I talk about citizenship being the sinew that ties together a nation and what gets people to do things and what gets people to work together. And it's that kind of an organization that, as Michèle said, is resilient and can deal with emerging problems because you can never anticipate all those problems. The challenge with that is you are talking about investing in something that's not as easily objectively counted as military units or things like that. And also, we tend to look at crises in short-term fashion. We think of ISIS as a crisis, an existential crisis. In the great scheme of existential crises, I don't think it is one. I think it is a problem in the world, but it's not a crisis. There are some crises that face America. One is our inability to govern ourselves now effectively. Could be a crisis if it continues. I think education is the kind of thing that can be a crisis that weakens our nation. So getting the narrative so that we can put in perspective those things which really matter, because a lot of your solutions take a long time. We are talking about something where we're investing in a number of generations year after year, and the payoff comes in decades, not in a year or two. And it's harder, I think, to mobilize people to invest in that kind of thing if the payoff is longer. And this is where I think it comes back to what both Seth and Michèle were talking about with data. I really think that we can harness data now to at least help support this. It's not a solution for everything, but it could connect some things. Like one of the numbers we see is if you do national service, you have a much higher likelihood of voting in the future, of volunteering in the future, of all the things that we normally equate with active citizenship. And if we can tie those kinds of things back, if we can tie them back to you do better in a job, all those kinds of things, the more we can tie those, I think would help us. But I think we're imperfect at that argument right now.
And I think what we do need to study, kind of like what you mentioned about the GI Bill, where, I'm pretty sure that, and I know Franklin has made some initial efforts in this regard, but $1 invested in a national service actually yields multiple dollars in terms of, economic, the well-being of communities in the United States, and at an individual level, probably the earning potential of that individual over their lifetimes.
I'll stress you mentioned data and databases and biometrics and the difference. I just was thinking how when I graduated college a few years before you, not so much longer, my older brother gave me a book that was something like 24 jobs in social justice. 24. That's what I knew. That was your data set that you were connected to of how do I start my life and career of doing something that I knew I was interested in international affairs at least to get to versus the massive amounts of data that would come with this kind of a project.
Just quickly, General McChrystal, you mentioned Tufts and what a leader they are being here. I was up at Tufts speaking last week, and they say kind of quietly, the sort of dirty little secret of this program is it's going to make better students, and we're going to have better graduates because they do national service. So it is they're not just doing something that's good for the country; they're doing something that's good for them too.
That's right. This woman in the red hair has been waiting for me next.
Thank you. Hi, I'm short, so I'll stand. I'm Angelique Young. I'm a Truman National Security Fellow, and I co-lead the Frontline Civilians Initiative with Rebecca Zimmerman. And I wanted to ask you, you've talked about things like the spectrum of service, a need for a recognition of the different things that come in that spectrum of service, but then also a need to inspire and incentivize individuals to want to do this sort of thing. They want to do the service, but how do you get them into these specific jobs and make it the most important thing? You know, and I want to point out that the frontline civilians community that exists, these are aid workers, diplomats, journalists, NGO workers. These are people who are essentially your ambassadors, who are serving on the front lines now or have served on the front lines in the past. And they are the people that can stand up and inspire young individuals and tell them just exactly what the value of national service is. But one of the things that we still see as a challenge that you, General, mentioned is this issue of recognition of that service and recognition of those tours that were also done in Afghanistan and Iraq and Mali and elsewhere. So how can we come back to that, getting the American public to really recognize the value of that service, which is going to help them be inspired to send their kids to those places?
I think one thing you need to have is veterans need to speak up.
Yeah.
Veterans need to talk about this. On the Armed Services Committee, I haven't done any study, but it just seems like it's often the veterans, the people who have spent time in the Middle East, who really understand the need for a political component to our fight more than anybody else. And it's the people who haven't fought who are more quickly to say, oh, just bomb them, just bomb them. So I think that's one place where we can help.
I think it's also trying to get, frankly, media interest in telling some of these stories.
I'm here.
I've been involved with another NGO called the Partnership for Public Service, and every year they do the Sammys Award. It's basically awards in various sectors from foreign affairs and national security to health to economics, and they basically profile remarkable civil servants and who've saved billions of dollars on a program or invented a drug that's going to help cure a type of cancer, or just unbelievable stories. And we have killed ourselves trying to get some kind of media coverage, like take a couple of the award winners and do little profiles on CNN or in Defense One or whatever, and it's like pulling teeth. It's, so they take, do a profile of a veteran in a second, but they won't necessarily profile these. So I think, trying to create some traction in the media, trying to tell these stories so people are aware, but also creating that pathway. How do I, okay, once you inspire someone, how do I actually become like you? How do I follow in those footsteps and lay out that bridge so that people know how to walk across it if they are inspired.
Let me take it even another step further. There are some people right now who have a megaphone that we get 50 or 60 people to listen to us. Donald Trump's getting 30,000. If you could get, and I don't single him out, but if you could get candidates to show real political courage and stand up and say, this is something I believe in, and be specific enough. If they just say, yeah, I believe in service, everybody should serve, and they leave it so amorphous that it means everything to whoever's hearing, then it's not very valuable. But if someone stands up and says, and they're going to take a little heat for it, because if you stand up and say it's two sides of the same coin, there are going to be some veterans who say, you're taking something away from me. Not many, but there'll be some. There'll be some other people who've got reasons against it. But if we believe in it, and we want to do it while somebody has the podium when people will listen, I think they ought to say it. And I'm listening for it, and I haven't heard much yet.
We'll have a lot to ask about the candidates, but we have probably time for one more. I do want to say before the last question, a couple times the Truman National Security Project has been mentioned, and we should probably explain a little bit of that. I wrote about this project in a feature article in Defense One, a National Journal last year. But it's an interesting example because of a political need, a service organization was created. So it's an interesting hybrid, but it's definitely a partisan one, where they base themselves. Their story is they base themselves off of heritage, and where the conservatives had, as they call it, an old boy network to help get their like-minded folks elected, and when they get elected, to populate government jobs. And so some young Democrats came together to form some different organizations, and out of it, it's a long story, Truman was born, where basically was to organize on the left Democrat people who were interested in national security, who wanted to come to Washington and get experience in think tanks, in government, in the military, different organizations, so that when their candidates are elected, they're ready to go and then could jump into and be effective governing managers of these institutions. It was very successful, and they'll say themselves they're at the next level of, all right, we did that. We got, Obama was elected, and there are a lot of people that are, second-term veterans, and one of them on this panel may be part of a future administration, maybe more of you actually. But what comes next to sustain that movement? But it was a partisan movement. So, and the idea of that somehow, I think we're kind of talking around a little bit of that some version of that is outside of politics, perhaps, but is still rooted in national security, that element of national service. So if you're interested in that, look up the Truman. Final question. I'll take two quick questions, then we'll go. But this gentleman here in the middle has had his hand up the entire time. Give us your quick question, and I'll take this quick question, and we'll answer them both to wrap it up.
All right, I'll try and be quick. My name is Tom Schaffner. I went to a school that was very focused on service, but one of the things that was noteworthy to me was those of us who studied math, science, or engineering often felt like the choice to go into service was to let our skills atrophy and/or lose job opportunities, because if you haven't looked at code for a year, employers are hard-pressed to say that they don't care. In your discussions about Teach for America or any of things, are there any work you're doing to foster STEM opportunities?
Good, a question on STEM, and then we'll get this gentleman on the other side. Take both questions, wrap them up, because our panelists need to be on their way.
Hi, I'm Paul Shelton. I'm a retired colonel, just retired from the Army G8. Before that was with the Army Capabilities Integration Center, where we integrate all these disparate things and put money toward them. And before that, I was a senior service college fellow at Tufts. I think as I sit here and I make observations about each one of these people's experience, it occurs to me that in the Army, we don't do anything without a requirement. We're a requirements-driven organization. If Congress doesn't mandate it, if DOD doesn't mandate it, we're not doing it. So I think the Congressman's mission here is, and I'm sorry if I'm giving my opinion here, but the Congressman's mission here is huge. And we got to get behind the Congressman. But I think our lines of effort need to be well drawn, and that creation of a validated requirement is key. And
Okay.
I think we're all behind this. I'm behind it, but I think that is the critical element in this discussion.
Okay, so both questions. Is there the requirement need that any of you are advocating for, and it's the support for STEM jobs or opportunities?
I do think we could set a national requirement that could be framed in some legislation, and really we have been thinking about how to sort of structure the different lines of service, if you will, military, global health, public health, economic and community resilience related, and others. But I really like the idea of a kind of digital service component. I mean, you see this now coming up in government. The U.S. Digital Service has been formed. Different departments are forming. But I think you could also envision a track of national security or national service that would leverage, I mean, it's sort of a hack for your country for a year. Not necessarily hack, but could be hacking, could be big data analytics, could be, creating, service-related apps. I mean, it could be all kinds of things, but creating a pipeline for that kind of talent to come spend a year doing this, it's an awesome idea.
Final remarks?
I mean, look, I just say, Colonel, I take this responsibility as an advocate for national security in Congress and national service very seriously. And I very much want to be a congressman who's known as a leader of this movement, and that's why I'm here this morning. It's why I'm working closely. Let me just take a few minutes as a member of Congress to tell you about how to create an efficient bureaucracy. That's why I'm looking to leaders like this to tell us how to do it. But I'll make a commitment to you and to everybody else here this morning that I will do this and I will work on it in Congress. So thank you.
Gentlemen, wrap us up.
Well, just thanks everybody for coming. And I know most of you already support. This is not something that will automatically happen. It will only happen if we make it happen. And we can make it happen, but it's going to take political push, it's going to take bottom-up push, it's going to take organizational skills, it's going to take all the things that can make a generally acceptable good idea practically achievable. And that's going to take an awful lot. I'm committed to it. I know Michèle and Seth are, and I know a tremendous number of people you met earlier who are just doing extraordinary work sort of in the shadows to make this happen. And anybody here we can enlist into that effort, and any of your friends, et cetera, I'd sure appreciate it.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have 3 Americans who long ago dedicated themselves to service, and Undersecretary Flournoy, General McChrystal, Representative Moulton. A round of applause for them and for the Aspen Institute. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for watching.
Great to see
Travel
you.
well.
Good to see you again. Take care.